A cold dawn broke over Borisovka, a village lost in the mud between Belgorod and Bohuduhev. In the sky, the drone of Junkers. In the ravines, snow baked into clay. On the roads, the grind of tank tracks. Here, amidst the copses and gullies, Soviet T-34s met face to face, for the first time, with something that did not yet have a name: the Tiger. The new German heavy tank, which had been lurking in the smoke of the battles for Leningrad, now stepped onto the wide arena of war. The location? 50 kilometers north of Kharkiv. The time? When the fate of the front hung by a thread. The result? Great bloodshed and a bitter lesson. The first encounter. The T-34s advanced in a line. Corps transferred within 24 hours from the southwestern front plowed through the spring thaw toward a defensive line already breached by units of the Grossdeutschland division. General Vovchenko threw his armor into the fray like a shield, covering the flank of the entire Voronezh front. Colonel Yegorov, commander of the 19th Guards Tank Brigade, was in the vanguard. His machines rushed toward Borisovka, unaware that behind the village outskirts, sheltered by mortars and artillery, German heavy tanks lay in ambush. No one in the Red Army had yet encountered them in battle. There were no tactics yet. There was still a belief that a standard T-34 could penetrate any armor. The first clash with the Tigers was a blow that no one foresaw. Their 88mm guns fired farther and more accurately than anything the Soviet tanks possessed. The T-34 turrets were pierced like tin cans. Shells fired at the German frontal armor produced nothing but sparks, and even flank shots often ricocheted. Captain Lifshitz tanks allowed the enemy to close to 800 meters. Too close, too late. Two tanks from Lieutenant Krevchenko's company erupted in flames after just 2 hits. A third managed to retreat into a gully and, with a shot to the side, finally knocked out one Tiger. But this was the exception, not the rule. Burning T-34s raced across the fields like torches of retreat. The Germans advanced slowly and methodically like a steamroller. Every step cost 5-7 machines. For the first time, commanders heard a terrifying phrase over the radio: "We cannot penetrate." It was then that the Soviet command first realized the game had changed. The counterstrike, intended to seize the initiative, turned into an exhausting defense using improvised ambush groups. The tankers under Yegorov and Lifshitz began to fight not by the manual, but by instinct, luring Tigers into fire traps, striking from the flanks, and aiming for the tracks. Motorized infantry, stripped of armored support, lay in open fields while artillerymen fired almost at point-blank range. At Borisovka, a tactic without illusions was born. Against superior armor and range, only coordination, speed, and risk ensured survival. Even tactical victories came at such a cost that every destroyed Tiger was paid for with a dozen T-34s, hundreds of lives, and tons of discarded optimism. The tragedy of Borisovka lay not only in the losses but in shattered hopes. General Vovchenko, barely coming to terms with the new reality, no longer ordered frontal assaults. He sought ways to bypass, lure, and deceive, but the Germans were not idle either. Their tanks, guided by voices from the air, increasingly acted under the cover of dive bombers, striking in unison as if guided by a single will. The enemy infantry dug in, their artillery worked with precision, and every Tiger encountered broke both the battle formation and the morale. Soldiers lost confidence and commanders lost time. For every Soviet maneuver, there was a German answer. The planned counterstrike, meant to straighten the front line, turned into a chaotic struggle to hold a bridgehead. With each passing day, it became clear the war had entered a new phase. The forces gathered for the decisive counterstrike began to crumble even before it started. Tank warfare does not forgive a rush. The Voronezh front had no time to concentrate reserves, plan cooperation, or suppress enemy firing points. Of the 67 machines gathered for the breakthrough, only a fraction reached the starting positions. The rest were lost in the rear, stuck in the mud, or became targets for dive bombers. When the attack finally began, the German units, the Grossdeutschland division, and its attached Tigers were ready. Their reconnaissance, artillery, and aviation worked like a well-oiled machine, slicing the offensive into waves and destroying them in piecemeal. Even the few T-34s that managed to close in were firing almost blind. Optics fogged up, they were outranged twofold, and shells hitting the Tigers' front did little more than scratch the paint.
Like a textbook maneuver, the Germans drew the Soviet brigades into a fire sack. While the Tigers picked off tanks from 2 kilometers away, aviation delivered precision strikes on vehicle concentrations and headquarters. Radio communication was severed in the very first raid. Battalion commanders shouted to one another from their hatches, but in the chaos of smoke and burning steel, even their own units were lost. By the evening of March 17th, the forward units of Vovchenko's corps had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Of the 25 T-34s thrown into the breakthrough toward Borisovka, only a handful remained operational.
The light T-70s were burning before they even reached the line. The offensive choked. The enemy held, and then they moved to the attack. The morning of March 18th brought no hope, only casualty reports. The 3rd Guards Tank Corps had lost more than half of its fighting machines, 110 T-34s, 46 T-70s, and nearly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Soviet tankers realized for the first time an enemy had appeared on the battlefield who could not be taken by frontal assault. The Tigers dictated a new reality: ambush combat, long-range engagements, defensive stance, and integrated air and artillery support. In those March days near Borisovka, the Red Army first encountered a system where a tank was not just a vehicle, but a node in a total war machine designed to annihilate an advancing foe. The command of the Voronezh Front attempted to organize a new counterblow. New divisions were brought up and flanking maneuvers for Borisovka were drawn. But it resembled an attempt to smother a fire with a wet handkerchief. Resources were meager, coordination was shattered, and time was lost. The Germans, conversely, regrouped, reinforced their artillery, and launched their own offensive toward Belgorod, Tomarovka, Khvostovka, Vorskla, names that sounded like a death sentence in the reports. The enemy is advancing, there is nothing to hold them back. At Borisovka, the illusion of the 1943 spring offensive died, and the realization was born that the war would now be fought not with the equipment of the Barbarossa era, but in the language of heavy tanks, jet propulsion, and preemptive tactics. All the Soviet units could offer in this sector was grit, improvisation, and sacrifice. Colonel Yegorov, having lost almost the entire strength of his 19th Guards Tank Brigade, did not retreat without orders. His tanks, exhausted and with shattered transmissions, fought to the last shell. Platoons became snares, hiding in gullies, along tree lines and on the slopes of nameless heights. Lone T-34s waited for a tighter to expose its side to make that single, precise, desperate shot. In these battles, even failure became a lesson. For the first time, techniques for fighting heavy tanks were forged. Maneuvering, ambush groups, targeting tracks, and coordinating with artillery.
Nevertheless, the outcome was brutal. The Germans held Borisovka and later Belgorod. The Voronezh Front's counterstrike failed not so much from a weak plan, but from a disconnect between ambition and reality. The Red Army went into battle with the same T-34s that had once shocked the Germans in 1941, but they were now facing an enemy of a different caliber. The Tiger was not a perfect tank, but it was exactly the weapon that gave the Wehrmacht a chance to turn the tide in a strategic defense. And though history remembers the Kursk Bulge and Prokhorovka, where the Tigers were eventually stopped, it was the thousands of soldiers at Borisovka who stopped them first, fighting not for a victory, but to buy their country the time to prepare for a new stage of the war.